Hello, everyone. I'm Mary Brandt. For those of you that don't know me, I am a pediatric surgeon who works currently in New Orleans. And as we're recording this, I'm in Houston because we're in the aftermath of Ida. We're here today to talk about a difficult topic with a group of people who are very passionate about this. And we invite you into what's going to be a conversation because we don't want to lecture you. For those that don't know, I've had a lifelong or career-long, I guess, interest in wellness for physicians and have evolved in my thinking, as I'm sure most of you have, that we're way past doing yoga and being resilient. And some of those buzzwords that make us all crazy, we need to think more deeply about this. For that reason, I actually went back to school. I got a graduate degree, a Master of Divinity degree from Iliff School of Theology because I needed a different vocabulary to think about that. And one of the great gifts I had in that education was meeting my friend Molly Booker, who is going to talk to us today about her story and some ideas about not just wellness, but about living with beyond wellness to thriving and not just surviving. So that's what we want to talk about today. We're going to do a global overview of what's going on in our culture as surgeons. Some of you who are individually hurting, we want you to hear that. We're here for you to hear this. For those of you who have people you work with or in your family that you're worried about, we want to give you a framework to think about what to do. And so with that, what I'm going to do is turn it over to Molly to tell us her story and give us a little bit of a framework about this.
Sure, thank you, Mary. So for me, the conversation around suicide started for me pretty young. I grew up in Colorado and had a great elementary school experience. I crushed elementary school, but then something started to shift between elementary school and middle school. And you talked, Mary, about language. I had no language or understanding for what just shifted in my world. I went from loving school came pretty easy, played soccer, one of the best on the team, which makes it pretty easy to feel included, and did sleepovers, and life was great. And then starting middle school, I had really obsessive, very racy thoughts in my mind, and really began to question myself and it started as a question like, maybe I'm not smart. And then it just became the understanding about myself that I'm ugly, I'm stupid, I don't fit in anywhere, really struggled with sleeping and struggled with food. And, it was just easily explained, like Molly's a picky eater, Molly's super shy, or those kind of things, and really started to withdraw. What I didn't know was happening was that these were signs of depression, and we weren't talking about any kind of mental illness at that time. So I didn't know that this was an illness. I thought all these things were personal defects, that, I'm not good because I'm withdrawing and people don't like me, and all these things are not good or not acceptable. And so this turned into, by the time I got to high school, pretty intense suicidal ideation. And that was really my constant thought every day. And it wasn't that I really wanted to die. It's like I didn't know how to live. Suicide is about pain and it's about loss. And that pain became so excruciating, I just didn't know how to deal with it. And here I am, I'm growing up in an environment that says, suck it up and be tough. Don't ask for help. That's a weak thing to do. And we certainly don't use counseling. And so any opportunity for help in there, I felt like wasn't there. So I just did the best that I knew how to do, was to suck it up and be tough. And that actually exacerbated it. So this ended up 23 years of stuck in that suicidal depression until I hit 35 in suicidal crisis. And that was the first time I really spoke up and said out loud, I think about killing myself all the time. And once I was able to speak it out, then I was no longer on a path of suffering. That began the path of healing. I don't know, is this a good place to kind of talk about more suicidal ideation overall, or
yeah, I think one of the things you've taught me, Molly, is that and how people react to their own guilt of someone who has died by suicide, and what it's actually like to have that tunnel vision. I think that's an important concept for people to understand.
Sure. So I think there are some misunderstandings about suicide that, I've heard, suicide is the easy way out. It doesn't alleviate pain. It just transfers it to somebody else, or that it's a very selfish act. I hear all of that, and I think one thing to help shed some light on this is suicide isn't about a desire to die. It's about pain and it's about loss. And so recognizing that if somebody is having thoughts of suicide, they're in a lot of pain, and that pain might be coming from physical pain, it might be coming from emotional pain. A lot of that can be contributed from some kind of loss. And so it's not, it's more helpful to think about how that individual is experiencing the loss as opposed to the loss itself. And to help understand that, kind of help make this clear, I'm going to use an analogy. And this analogy comes from the ASSIST, which is Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training, which I highly recommend. It's a 2-day intervention training. But they use this analogy of a river. And to be clear, there's no river of suicide. That does not exist. This is an analogy. It's a metaphor here. So if we think of a river, where the river starts, you have all these contributaries. And we can think of that as our community. And we have things that are very life promoting in our community. Maybe we have connections, we have our family, we have friends, we have colleagues, we have diet and nutrition and sunlight and rest and all those things that can be really life promoting and help in communities. We also have those things that are more risk factors that can be that can contribute to somebody having thoughts of suicide. And a lot of those things have loss in common. So it can be loss of a job. It can be, a loss of a home through natural disaster or through an unwanted move. It can be loss of freedom with upcoming incarceration. It can be loss of a connection. So that can be through a breakup or a divorce or a death, particularly if by suicide, loss of a pet. So we have these things that can be challenging, that can be stressors in our community, that can have somebody begin to think about suicide. And so what we try to do in our community is put up these kind of life protective barriers. So we think of all these contributaries. But the thing is that suicide is very unique to an individual. Something that can contribute to one person having thoughts of suicide, somebody else can navigate with a lot of resiliency. So it's not necessarily about the event, but how that individual is experiencing that event. So because of that, we do have some people that cross over that life protective barrier and enter into this, again, an analogy, river of suicide, so to speak. And so there's a couple different things. I'll talk about what it feels like to be in the river in just a second. But for some, this is a very fast journey. I mean, you can think of a really fast current from the time that they experience that loss or that thing that might happen, having them start thinking about suicide to the point where they're actually having suicidal behaviors or attempting suicide can be quick. It can be, even within one day or a few hours. So that can be a very fast current. Or you can have people like myself who are in that river for decades. There can be, swimming around in an eddy for quite a period of time. That intensity of the suicidal ideation can be really intense, or it just can be a thought that's happening. So it gives us a framework to think about this. So for me, being in that river, the best I can describe it is like if you've ever received some just extremely devastating news that somebody that you love has died, an accident has happened, or you made a mistake, or something embarrassing or humiliating. And when you feel that in your body, it's just kind of that like, and you kind of catch your breath or your stomach just tightens. And there's this moment that feels like, oh my gosh, I'm not sure I'm going to be okay. I'm not sure this is going to be okay. That feeling that feels awful and horrendous to me is how that feeling, having thoughts of suicide, felt. It just felt like this kind of clenched breath. It felt tight, and it just felt like this overwhelming feeling of it's not going to be okay. And it just wouldn't let up. Nothing seemed to help that in that time. And so what can happen in that overwhelming pain, I mean, think of other times when maybe you've been in pain, maybe migraine headaches, or maybe really intense abdominal pain. When you get in that time, it's hard to see anything but just the pain. And so one thing is, like, if you take your hand and make this like teeny little pinhole, you guys try it. Just get a teeny little pinhole, right? And looking normally, you can see everything on the screen. We can see all of us here. We can see that we're having a conversation. But if you look through that little pinhole, the only thing you can see is yourself. Everything else, it's like it's not even there. And that's when it felt like for me, when that suicidal intention got really strong, is that I mean, it didn't occur to me to reach out to somebody else. It didn't occur to me that I had two loving parents that I could call. It didn't occur to me to reach out to my brother. It's like it's like they didn't exist. I just couldn't even see them. The only thing that I could see was this overwhelming pain that I didn't know if it was ever going to let up or ever get better. And so in that time, they call that tunnel vision. Just like in those times when you're in that throes of pain, I mean, it's, somebody's talking to you and they're like, rapid fire questions of like, hey, can I get you some Gatorade? Do you need ginger ale? Do you want me to get you some crackers? Are you going to throw up? And it's like, oh my gosh, just stop talking. I can't even think about any of those things. I just, I'm just in this tight little ball. And suicidal ideation can feel that way. So, if individuals are living with those thoughts of guilt of having somebody that they love that died by suicide, and feeling like, how did I not see that? How did I not reach out? How come they didn't call me? I would have been there. For me in those times, like it just didn't occur to me, which is why this conversation is so important. It feels, at least for me, it felt impossible to speak those words out of, I need help, or I'm in pain, or I'm thinking of killing myself. It's like the words just got stuck and I just couldn't get them out. So that's kind of the analogy of somebody drowning in, that they're thrashing and they're desperate for the help. But swimming out or reaching your hand up just feels like impossible. And so what we need to get better about doing is not asking somebody to like swim over to the edge of the river, or, hey, lift your arm up, by saying those things. Well, you need to learn to ask for help. It's more about reaching our hand out and actually pulling somebody out, which is having this conversation, which is saying the word suicide, talking about it, taking it out of the darkness into the light, asking somebody, are you thinking of killing yourself? If we're worried, we can get into more of those things later. But that gives us a little bit of a picture on how to talk about suicide and what it might feel like in the midst of suicidal ideation.
Molly, thank you for that, for being so vulnerable and talking to us about it. I think in surgery in particular, where we do have a lot of losses every day and we learn how to cope with them and deal with them, but they kind of add up. We're really lucky to have with us today Dr. Carter Liberis and Dr. PJ O'Neill, who also are going to bring their own personal experience, but their expertise as well to this. And PJ, do you want to start with a little bit of your story and we'll go from there?
Mary, thank you. Molly, I do appreciate the rawness of your story. And I think part of the problems we as surgeons face is from a very early start, we're taught to, from applying to medical school to completing medical school, getting your residency fellowship job, you're taught and conditioned to be hyper competitive and out for yourself. You put yourself on an island. We're expected to be independent, self-reliant. We all remember our chief resident saying, call me for anything, but calling is a sign of weakness. Joke or not, that's the crucible that we must endure to prove our worth. We're on an island alone with zero tolerance for error. As we progress through our careers, we have a much smaller and more elite peer group. They're all high achievers, and sometimes we question, do we really belong there? Are we as good as them? Are we an imposter? You don't dare talk about it or look for support. You keep it inside and it just festers. Struggle that each individual may have is an axis 1 disorder or low self-esteem, childhood trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, compassion fatigue, chronic pain, or drug and or alcohol abuse. Fill in the blank. And whatever we struggle with is ours, and it's very real. We don't know it at the time, but the truth is everybody has their demons. They all have their doubts. Other people, our peers, these high achievers, these people we look up to, they all have similar health issues, financial strain, relationship problems, and now we're all faced with this COVID pandemic and what it's done to us. Everybody's suffering in some capacity. As physicians, we thrive on objective evidence. But if we really are objective with our personal and professional life, undoubtedly we'll show that we're deviating off the course. We keep everything between the lines until we don't. When we struggle, it affects our abilities. We're at a fork in the road that I just can't overemphasize enough. Do we have the insight and wherewithal to pop the chute and get help before something bad happens? Or do we roll the dice and accept the myriad of potential complications? Problem is, we live in a culture that just doesn't look well on us asking for help. Again, we go back to being on an island, being self-sufficient. There's all kinds of metaphors. We're a shark, swimming the oceans. That's how we are around the hospital. But the truth is, we're surgeons, we're also human beings, and we need to take care of ourselves and each other before we can truly be effective and at our best for our patients. What I don't understand is, for the most part, we're well compensated and accomplished. We're in the club. We've checked all the boxes. But why don't we show more empathy toward ourselves, toward our colleagues? We've poured all of our empathy into our patients. And as Carter will talk about, our reservoir runs dry. Unfortunately, rolling the dice and seeing what road that takes us on, at some point, that road's not going to have a U-turn. Arguably, the greatest sign of strength that one can show is to pop the chute and ask for help. The hardest thing you're ever going to do as a surgeon is to admit to yourself and others that you're human and that you need help. Problem is, whether you pop the chute or head down that pathway and have an event that occurs, you then get put on the radar for the hospital or the board. That's the biggest fear we have. The system that we have right now doesn't differentiate between the two. The system views us as machines and that we're not allowed to have flaws. But I would argue that if you proactively seek assistance before a tragic event occurs, there should be one reward. There should be a carrot, not just sticks. So when a surgeon enters into the system, they're subjected to further emotional, moral, and financial injuries. The exact fear that kept them from seeking help in the first place. It's no wonder some surgeons see suicide as a more viable option than taking the time and money for themselves to get healthy. They fear job loss, reputational damage, income loss, relationship loss if they sought help. When in actuality, they're already suffering these injuries because more than likely they're functioning at well below their true potential. The irony is getting healthy will only make them better. So to help ourselves, we need to be honest and open. We need to ask for help. We need to offer help. We realize that we're all in the same healthcare boat that's careening down this class 5 rapids with our only chance of survival being able to work together and take care of each other. We currently lack a system, however, that's expedient, caring, constructive, and anonymous that can salvage these precious healers, make them well, and get them back to the top of their game. Without change in these 3 key areas, taking care of the individual, themselves, and your colleagues, changing the culture of how we view wellness and illness, and a system that actually is constructive, not destructive, more surgeons, I fear, will be lost forever.
PJ, thank you so much for that. When we were all chatting before we started this recording, one of the things we were talking about is, and I think Carter's going to talk about this more in detail, but we save lives. I mean, we are part of an organization, the American College of Surgeons, who, a century ago, basically, looked at all the deaths in the United States from trauma, which was overwhelming, and came up with a system that resulted in accredited trauma centers and ATLS and education. And so part of it is, how do we create models and systems that look at this objectively, like we're talking about today, that say these are precious healers, just like our patients are precious. How do we save these lives too? How do we create that system? And that's something that Dr. Carter Liberis has been thinking about and writing about for a while. And so I'm going to turn it over to you now, Carter, to lead us into the next part of the discussion.
Hi, guys. So I'm Carter Liberis, and I have been thinking about this kind of issue, physician well-being, for some time, even before I entered into independent practice, but especially when I became a faculty member. And I think in both realms, whether you're a trainee or a practicing surgeon, these issues are incredibly important. And I think it's equally important that to begin addressing this, we have to think about what are the models and stereotypes and kind of cultural mores that we have created for ourselves in surgery. I think it is important we recognize that we need symbols of belonging, we need symbols of strength, we need to have mental models that allow us to feel capable and courageous about the work we do. And that's just a fact of how challenging our profession is. But for instance, we've all heard the metaphor about swimming with the sharks. And while that's resonated with me in the past, and I think resonated with a lot of us, that's really just a metaphor that someone made up. Someone at one point in time chose that that was the way we should think about this sister and brotherhood that we have in the fellowship of the American College, in the global community of surgeons. But the fact is, in Aztec culture, some of the most revered symbols of strength and warriorship was the monarch butterfly. And think about how different those two symbols are. And I think that's important for us to consider. I'm not proposing that we change the logo of the ACS to a butterfly, but I am saying what we decide to envision, to conceptualize as our symbol, as the things that we identify with, and then in particular, the frameworks that we put around the issues that we're trying to address are critically important. So in that regard, those of us in this group have been talking for some time about what that conceptual framework might look like. And so I'll share my screen with you to show you what we've been working on. And this is by no means a final product. We're really introducing it to the surgeon community as a means of starting a conversation around how do we begin to think about this incredibly visceral and emotional topic, whether you're a person who's experiencing depression or suicidal ideation, whether you're a close friend or loved one of someone in that situation, or whether you're simply a peer or a person in a leadership position who wants to be an ally in this regard. It helps us to have some first pass, some initial model to work with. So in this model, we're thinking about the life of a surgeon as a tank. And part of that tank will always be filled with the inherent stress of what we do. There's no way that running a code, trying to save someone spiraling down the drain in the ICU, or an incredibly long operation, or a moment of uncontrolled blood loss will ever not feel stressful. It just will. And so that right away sets the stage for us that it's important we don't try for a goal of a stress-free life. We don't pretend that will ever really be possible to shed all of that. We need to instead, I think, recognize that there will always be a certain amount of stress, and therefore our stewardship, our management of this buffer zone between stress that's inherent and stress that's overwhelming, that we take that stewardship very seriously, because that buffer is often not all that big. And so that's what this diagram shows is we, as you see on the left, we start out with this stress level. We start out with a reservoir, a space between the top of the stress and flowing over the tank. And that danger zone is when things flow over. And there are many ways that we can alter that ratio. And so some of those have to do with us as individuals. Some of those have to do with the systems that we work within. And then some have to do with the culture around us. And so if you look at the first arrow, heading straight across, that's talking about proactive things that we can do to help ourselves. And so this may look like defending our work-life balance, prioritizing time that we spend in self-care, recognizing, as Molly said, that there are many tributaries that lead into this river. And so it's not really enough just to have one thing that makes us feel satisfied and encouraged and fulfilled with our lives. Because if we make that one thing just our work, whether that's our academic or clinical work, when we make it that one thing and something goes wrong, then what else do we have? And the truth is that in this field, no matter what a person comes in with, no matter what your baseline native strength or vulnerability is, all of us are at risk for having stress that's overwhelming and tumbling over into burnout or suicidal ideation or some other form of mental illness. And the reason for that is because stress and those types of challenges are just a workplace hazard when you're a surgeon. And that's not a declaration of defeat or discouragement. It's just a fact. And it's a fact that on the cultural level, the military has had to recognize, commercial aviation has had to recognize, and in so doing, both of those organizations have made huge cultural shifts to normalize mental health, to normalize the provision of cognitive skills training and an open dialogue and a culture of acceptance for their workers, for their members. So those kinds of cultural shifts in high performance, high stress professions that have human lives at stake at the center, it can be done. And so that means we can do it too. And being that we're surgeons, we can probably do it better. Anyway, the other two ways that we describe here of keeping that reservoir strong can also involve looking at the systems around us. Where do we have entrenched systems that are draining, that are unnecessary, that have just sort of evolved because we've been asked to do these things or someone's assumed that we just will? We have the imperative to draw some boundaries around that and push back as a group of physicians who have tremendous resources to contribute and therefore tremendous clout. I think it's our duty to look at some of these entrenched systems and demand that they be changed. And then there's, as I said, this proactive side of helping ourselves, and then this responsive side, which is both culture with a capital C, how we envision ourselves, monarchs or sharks, how we think about mental health as something dark and shameful or something that's just a workplace hazard, but then also our day-to-day little c culture, which is to say, it can't just be big responsive moves that help us fix this. It also needs to be just a day-to-day change in even how we interact with each other. So one proposition is that we talk more openly, how are you today? And actually listen when people tell us a real answer. This, I think, starts laying the bricks for whatever this bigger house is that we want to build. So those are my thoughts on this.
Carter, thank you so much. It's a wonderful model that you've created that we've all sort of been helping work on. And I hope a framework for us to all think about how we change ourselves, our culture little c, our culture big C, and surgery. You talked about the day-to-day things, and I do agree with you. I think, you know, we all get the spidey sense or worry about a colleague, and particularly after they've had a major event, whether it's a mistake or a patient dies unexpectedly, or their wife or husband or spouse has left them. And we know something's going on, and we go up to them and say, hey, are you okay? And they always answer, no, I'm fine. And I think we all need to have the next sentence, whatever that is, which, you know, and Molly talks about this all the time too. It's like, no. That's like, hi. That tells me nothing. How are you really? Or if it's not in the right place to say, you know, we're in a really stressful job, so I'm going to come back tomorrow and check on you again because I'm worried about you. And I wondered, PJ, from your perspective, or Carter, if you have what other little specific, take this home and try this tomorrow tool can we give everyone who's listening?
You know, the problem is, until we change the global picture and make it okay to be vulnerable, we're barking up the wrong tree. A surgeon could have cancer, and they get tons of empathy, a lot of grace, and that's acceptable. But yet, any of the number of things that I mentioned are thought to be defects, largely, and you don't get the same empathy from your peers, but and yourself as well. You know, you think, well, these other people aren't having these problems. Well, they are, and they hide it just as well as you did until they don't. And the problem is, fine, you get your colleague to confide in you, or you confide in your colleague, then what? There's really no good options.
I'll push back, and I totally agree with you. But I think in the moment, listening is healing. And I think unless we individually all say, I'm going to do what I can individually, and I'm going to, particularly if I have a position of power or authority, I am really going to start working on the big picture, on what do we do with surgeons who have substance abuse? What do we do with mental illness if they break after a horrible series of events? I mean, I totally agree with that, but I think it's got to be the two-pronged or multi-pronged approach of tackling this on all levels. Carter, do you have any thoughts?
Well, you know, what I try to practice is what I preach. So if I'm going to ask someone to get naked at work, I better be ready to show up naked too. So if I approach someone and I sense that there's something going on, or I've heard that they had something unexpected and traumatic happen in the OR, I'll ask, you know, how are you? Are you okay? You know, do you want to talk about it? But I'll often just say, man, last week I did this thing. I felt like such an idiot. Or, you know, sometimes I work so hard at work. I come home, I just feel like, wow, it's great. I've given everything to be such a champ for the world. And then I get in a fight with my husband. And I'm just like, what? You know, I'm supposed to be rewarded. And instead I'm fighting with my husband. I mean, I share it. I share my own, you know, hurdles and struggles and pratfalls to model what it is I hope we will begin to change towards. And the interesting thing is, it helps me too, because admitting when I mess up, when I'm not in a kind of overwhelmed frame of mind, I realize that admitting messing up is just part of breathing. It's part of being alive. I mean, you may not talk about it, but everyone's, you know, making faux pas or, you know, falling on their face periodically just in the process of life. And that kind of protects me too. because then when I really am hurting, that muscle is there. That dialogue's been started. So I don't know, maybe that's a good first reply, is not you divulge to me, but rather let me show my vulnerability to you.
There's one other thing maybe we could think about, which is an in-between. I've called this rapid response teams because we all understand that, right? But Carter, if you call me and say, hey, I just heard PJ had a death in the OR, there should be a system in place in every hospital that automatically has peer support go that is, so there's no asking for it or needing it, or, and there's many options, many examples of this around the country. I'm thinking of Joe Shapiro in particular, and some others who, you know, you basically, if this happens, someone's going to show up and say, here's, I'm here to talk about the tools and let you know you're not alone. And, but it's not your best friend going, hey, are you okay?
Yeah.
And I think we all need to push for that in our hospitals.
You have to normalize that, though. You know,
Yes.
It's like the code team. When you know, you have graded levels of code, you know, the rapid response, when someone is having a little bit of problem, the code, when it's full code. But when you normalize that response, then it becomes more acceptable. Then people, once they see it's more acceptable, they're more willing to participate. But
and certainly that's what the commercial aviation industry did. You know, in the mid 90s, there were, I think, 2 incidences where suicidal pilots waited until their co-pilot went to the restroom, locked the door, locked the controls in a downward nosedive, and took themselves and all passengers out with them. Mm-hmm. And so the commercial aviation global community really had to pull back and say, what are we going to do about this? And to their credit, they demanded a shift in the cultural conversation, recognizing that being punitive about people asking for help or being shameful about people feeling they need help was creating this culture where people didn't get help, and the consequence could be dire. So, as you say, both of you, there are great models for us in very similar in professions where they've said any critical incident, so any potentially traumatic stressor, and that can be a critical incident that ends in a death, but it can also be a critical save, requires that we take those actors that were centrally involved and remove them for a short period and just make sure that they're not having cognitive impairment or emotional impairment from what they just experienced. And that's done actually automatically. I'm not proposing that necessarily, but I am saying I agree that automatic, systematized, accepted way of acknowledging that these events are profound and deserve a thoughtful response.
You know, one of the models that I've been working on, as you guys know, for wellness is really that it's a little more like systemic inflammatory response syndrome. There's all these different things that can cause it, but they tend to fall into 3 big buckets in my view. One is self-care, knowing about self-care, but honestly, that's the smallest bucket because we're all talking about that a lot. But the other one I think you just hit on a little bit is a failure to recover from injury. And one of the things that we have in our work is every day's little paper cuts, you know, whether it's the EMR or whether it's, you know, discussions in a committee that don't go well, little things and up to big things. And we all know if you break a bone, you've got to let it heal. But if you are getting those kinds of emotional injuries at work, we just don't take time off to let them heal, especially the big ones. The third big bucket that is, I think, more like what you're talking about, PJ, with the whole system is moral injury, that we often find ourselves working in environments where the values are not in alignment with our values. And I think as we move forward and develop ways to help each other, I couldn't agree with you more, Carter. We've got to get rid of the sharks. We got to think about how do we envision this in a objective way, the same way we did trauma a century ago, to have the American College of Surgeons and all of us work into a space where we normalize this and we start really helping each other.
We all know that using geology principles that you build mountains with steady pressure over time, but I think we're in a crisis where we need to be a little bit more proactive. I don't know what the answer to that is, but with the current statistics of physician suicide, we need to move fast.
I agree. And in my mind, any surgical historian can point out all the times that as a field, we've conquered incredibly dangerous or overwhelming or mysterious phenomena within medicine and found our way to the other side. So I absolutely believe that we're up to this. And I think that it does take some form of us strengthening ourselves and strengthening one another. And so those are, individual and local community types of things. But I also think it requires us through our surgeon eyes to look at the systems around us and be specific, whether that's through studying and generating data, like many groups are doing around the country right now, or simply looking locally and drawing parallels between non-productive or non-useful tasks that we're being asked to do that are contributing to that paper cut load, and saying on a national level, on a non-professional level, shift that. That needs to go somewhere else. And culturally recognizing that there's no room for people to recover if there's no redundancy in the system. And so what would it look like to build redundancy into surgical practice? And before we all recoil, it's only strange. It's not necessarily bad to conceive of things that way. And the way we do things now, for good or ill, was in large part just made up by some other people in the past. Some of it is evidence-based, and that which is, we should keep. But that which isn't, just like making everybody have an NG tube after surgery for days or weeks on end, it doesn't work. So why keep doing it? So I think collectively, we have this tremendous capability and this tremendous imperative to fix this. And now.
In a perfect world, it would be nice to have our hospital administrators have a metric that goes to their promotability, that looks at physician wellness and healthcare provider wellness. These programs cost money, and most systems aren't willing to put money into these things because they don't see it as important.
I wonder though now, in light of all of the nursing and other people leaving healthcare, if there's not a little crack in that armor, and if they're not also realizing that the way that they've created a business model for medicine is out of alignment with the values of the people that are in medicine, and also that if you keep injuring people, whether it's, and I don't believe it's intentional, I think this has just evolved, that doesn't help you in the long run. So I think we have to keep bringing that back to their attention, learning to speak their language. I don't believe administrators come to work to try to do harm. I just don't think they understand. And so I think that's part of the data collection and the conversations that we need to have. And you know what? It was the same for trauma. It was the same for oncology. It was the same for everything that surgeons have tackled in hospital systems. People did not want to pay for trauma accreditation. I mean, we've done this before. We can do it again.
I do think a really hopeful, more recent development is research that's coming out linking familiar metrics of surgeon well-being, such as burnout, with PTSD, and really showing this tremendous correlation association. So for instance, in general surgery, high emotional exhaustion, which is very common, high prevalence measure of burnout, increases the odds of having PTSD fivefold, nearly fivefold.
Mm.
And what's important about that is the body of literature from the military and aviation describing the unbelievable economic burden of PTSD in people within those professions. That body of literature is vast. And I know that there was a Rand Corporation report that was put out just a few years ago for the military, estimating the full cost of this on an annual basis. And it was billions of dollars. And as a consequence, the military poured a ton of resources into intervention and prevention. And so I think that bridge is being built. That takes us from our experience and our clearly understood need for change and the economic argument that that needs to be supported in a meaningful and substantive way by the organizations that we work with and for.
Well, I think we're nearing the end of our time together, and I would ask each of you, do you have any final words that you'd like to share, PJ?
I think, at least in my case, when you're in the throes of fill in the blank, you really feel isolated. You feel you're the only person on the planet who is going through that, understands it. Nobody gets me, nobody cares. And that tunnel vision example that Molly gave us is true. On the other side, you're shocked that, as educated as we are, we felt that way. It just goes to prove we're human. And as human, we're subject to everything else that everybody else has. We're not special being surgeons, and we need to listen to that. And more than anything, when we're not at our best, we're not at our best for a lot of things: our families, our careers, our patients. So getting ourselves to our best benefits all.
Wise words. Carter?
Well, gosh, I would just echo what PJ says and say, hang in there. We're fixing this. It is going to be fixed.
And join us.
Yeah.
Join us and help us fix this, because, the more people that in your individual institutions pick up that banner and carry it, the quicker we're going to be able to change the culture, and save lives. So it's time we just do it. We're surgeons, for crying out loud. Let's get it done.
I really want to thank Dr. Liberos, Dr. O'Neill, and everyone at the American College of Surgeons who has recognized that this is an urgent crisis for the world of surgery. If you personally are struggling, know that you're not alone. I'm sure I speak for all of us. If you need to reach out to us, that's great. We will help you find help. If you know someone who you're worried about, reach out as well. Reach out to them, reach out to resources. And as PJ said, join us, because I think this is a commitment that we are able to make as the House of Surgery to protect each other and our patients. So I just wish everyone well, and thank you so much for the time you spent listening to us.